Since his retirement in 2017, John has maintained an active interest in interreligious issues. For several years, he was moderator of the Anglican Primate Philip Freer's regular public conversations, and he is currently a member of the advisory board of the Muslim interfaith group, the Affinity Intercultural Foundation. Let's give a very warm welcome to John.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction. When Kate contacted me and invited me to be part of today, it was just a little drum was beating in my head, and it wasn't a Salvation Army drum. I first came to Sydney in 1983, 40 years ago, the year Eremos commenced. But prior to that, I'd already been introduced into some of the substantive work that was to become Eremos, because I was first appointed to the ABC in 1980 in Melbourne, and they immediately sent me to Perth. And one of the first people I met and encountered in Perth was that indomitable sister Veronica Brady. And Veronica and I became firm and argumentative friends, as you could, with Veronica. And she sort of opened me to a much wider world, and I had the pleasure of producing a number of programs with her in her own inimitable style. And it was a pleasure on receiving this book to see Veronica as featured. And of course I arrived in Sydney, was in Sydney for a number of years, active in affairs in the staff union and other things in Sydney. And lo and behold, the ABC is turned from a commission to a corporation, and who's on the first board of directors of the ABC? Sister Veronica Brady. So we renewed our association in quite different roles, but it was something that was kept over the years. During my years with the ABC, I had the privilege of working with people like Charles Birch and in a documentary, and only most recently, another writer finished bookends my career, and one of the final entries in this is by Tony Hassan. And Tony and I worked together very closely at the ABC. So I feel in a way my career's been bookended by Eremos. And in a wider way, we're part of a wider conversation, because we have all, over the last 40 years, seen a revolution in the way our society works, and have been ferried along that path and that journey by a magazine such as that produced by Eremos. So I do feel at once a privilege and almost at home in coming to a gathering like this. Let me introduce to you those others who'll be joining us this afternoon. Margaret Ackland, a foundation member of Eremos, who designed the Eremos logo and contributed significant artworks over the years. John Fulcher, Eremos editor, is a poet and retired teacher, and his most recent book of poetry, Dancing with Stephen Hawking, was shortlisted for the 2022 Prime Minister's Literary Awards. And Linda Turton, a member of Eremos during its first year, and somebody who's attended retreats and events over the years, wrote for Eremos Book News and initiated a book discussion group in the Upper Hunter. And she was Associate Director from 1996 to 2007. So we're in rich company this afternoon. And feel free, as we go on, to share in the discussion. You're going to have observations that you want to make about the way the world has changed over the last 40 years. And you may have the odd anecdote to throw in about how Eremos has influenced that. But first, right now, it's my privilege to turn things over to Kate Scholl, who's going to discuss with us an image.
Look at this beautiful image. I don't know what your reaction was when you first saw it, when you opened the envelope or the email with the magazine on it. But when John sent it to me as one of the possible covers that Margaret had done, it took my breath away. It was just so evocative. So turn to the person sitting near you and just chat to them about what does it evoke for you? What is this feeling? What does it spring up within you as you look at that image? Just for a couple of minutes, just to have a little chat, and then I'm going to ask you for some words in a few minutes. So just have a little chat with a couple people sitting near you. Thank you. Okay, we might just leave it at that, and I'm going to invite just for you to share some words, and I'll come around with the microphone. Those of you who are on Zoom, if you would like to share in the chat, and Bethany will report those to us. So who would like to share a word or two from your conversation? Maybe one or two words isn't enough. Okay, I'll give you 3 or 4. How's that? We got one here, Therese?
Reflection.
Okay, reflection. What else? Yes.
Islamic art.
Thank you.
It's a self-portrait, if you look closely.
Bethany?
We have several comments from people on Zoom. One, that the colour of those petals reminds me that it is autumn and reminds me of Hopkins' poem to Margaret. Another comment, I see the half-full element, and yet there is more for Eremos moving forward. The clarity of the water in the jar is quite beautiful too. The image says so much. We see ourselves reflected in the glass jar. We see the Islam-style tiles, which speaks of our multi-faith, and the Australian flowers above the bush. Another one, fishes swimming upstream. And another one, a container for nourishing growth.
Thank you. Great work, Zoom, folks. Thank you. What else? Yes, Alec?
I thought it had a very stilling effect on me. It kind of drew me in and just held me, and very gently. And, you know, at first it could appear as being busy, but I found it just really very centering and very stilling.
Lovely, thank you. Did you have a comment?
Something about growth beyond the container, that both the plant and indeed the tessellating image that continues to infinity.
Thank you. Yes, Glenda.
Just building on the comment about the background being Islamic art, we mentioned this too and thought how it reflects how Eremos has gone beyond being contained purely within a Christian tradition. It's gone into interfaith. I find that background really exciting, that it's broadened and inclusive in that way.
John and Margaret, let's hear what you have to say about this.
So, Margaret, you've heard some responses to your work. This is only one of which we should threaten them to bring out all 17 covers that you've done over the years. We could spend an afternoon seminar.
Yes, that's
So, what was in your mind?
Well, when John rang and asked me, quite selfishly, I suppose, I responded because I could figure out a way of fitting it into what I've currently been preoccupied with, which is, you know, the still life that's also an interior, that's also a self-portrait, that's also a distortion. And I've just been interested in that because, when you look at a still life that's, you know, on just a piece of paper or a canvas, it's an illusion anyway. You're drawing on the Renaissance conventions of perspective. So I'm creating an illusion by responding to things that are in front of me. and so it's a distortion in a way, and then the subject matter are distortions. So that the beautiful photograph by, I think, Christine Gapes, that was used on that, I think it was August 2018 cover. I like that because it was a photograph and it was, you know, the natural world that I could then bend into my little still life that reflects the room that I was sitting in when I did it, and my own silhouette is sitting there. And I like the way the water distorts. It's actually a crucifix orchid that's in the jar, and I chose that particular pattern in the background because there are crosses and there are Islamic patterns, and you know, I'm a bit of a pattern fiend anyway, so that's why I chose that. I actually did 2 covers for it, and I can't remember what it was I didn't like about the first one. And I nearly did this one again, and then I had to slap myself around and say, no, just leave it.
The first thing that occurred to me when I saw it was, we've got a plant growing out of a jar full of water, that's fine, but the water in the jar, the water is contained, and the jar is a container that's sort of manufactured. There's some sort of bits and pieces you can sort of play with.
A lot
there.
of bits and pieces. And, you know, there's a glass that's distorting the reflection, and there are man-made things and there are natural things, and there's the actual Eremos magazine, and it's all a distortion and an illusion anyway. So there we are.
Any comments that people would like to make about the work and what Margaret's had to say?
Yes, that's the double doors of our apartment. I'm sitting on the dining table painting the picture, and I can see, so I'm looking at what I can see, the distorted image of Christine Gapes that was used on that cover. And I can see my own environment, and I can see myself. So there's lots of things that I started doing this body of work really in COVID, when at the very beginning we were just in our apartment most hours of the day, and as I will often do when I'm not sure about what else to do, I'll go back to still life. And I was just sat with things, and the more I looked, the more I saw, and you know, I'd sketch something up and then look again and think, oh, I can see it. Oh, there I am in the handle of that silver pot or whatever. And I got really interested in all the little incidental distortions and inversions and things that I would see.
Well, Margaret, thanks for that insight into your work and into yourself.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. No, stay there,
Oh.
because we're going to be joined now by... we're going to make a little panel, folks. John Fulcher is going to join us, and Linda's going to join us as well. So why don't you come and join us here? You can stay where you are. Or... Now, we're joined by 2 people who've been central to both the past and the present of Eremos. Let me first turn to the editor of this anniversary edition, John Fulcher. John, 25 articles out of 40 years. How'd you approach that?
Yeah, it's a good question, John, and it was a very difficult process trying to figure out which articles were going to be in, and I didn't do it alone. That's really important. The whole idea of doing something like this had its genesis in an issue from last year, which was leading up to the 40th anniversary, where I interviewed 2 of the people who were seminal for the creation of Eremos, and that was Colin Alcock and Don Meadows. There was a trinity of Colin, Don and Bruce Wilson who set it up. And they started talking about why Eremos existed at all and where it came from. And I think we'll be talking more about that as we go on. But it sent me back to looking at those early issues of Eremos, because my association with Eremos was I was involved but peripherally right from the beginning, and then sort of literally walked off into the wilderness for about 30 years until Francis Mackay, my previous editor, approached me and said, "Do you want to edit it?" And I thought, well, I'm the prodigal son coming home, and did. But when I started looking at those early issues, what struck me was the quality of the writing. Now, some of those articles were reflective of the zeitgeist, and I was reminded of that this week when I got a phone call from Colin Alcock, who has the very first article in the magazine. And in the very first paragraph, he labels homosexuality as a sin. And he was mortified. And he wants me to correct that. He was quite happy to have his article there, but he was mortified at the fact that he'd said that. And he wanted me to correct it, to make sure that everybody knew that he doesn't think that anymore. But it was interesting because it got me thinking about some of these articles. They reflect the zeitgeist. In my editorial, I made it clear that we were not going to change the past. Some of the language you wouldn't use now, particularly in relation to Indigenous Australians and things like that. So I thought, will we change it? I thought, no. We at Eremos don't believe in tidying up the past to make it look better. And so some reflected the zeitgeist, and then some were just as relevant now as they were then. So, John, when I was putting together, I made a short list of about 40 articles which did either one or both of those things. And then I put it to the council to choose their top 25 articles out of that 45 that I'd given them, and used a coloured numbering system to indicate what they thought. And there was a lot of overlap on the first 10 articles. Most people, the first 10 articles were agreed. There was only one article where everybody said this has to be in, and that was Elaine Alinta's article. But when we got down to the final 15, that's when I decided, right, I have to act as an editor now. And so I chose the ones that I thought were doing that. What I wanted to say was there were some very fine articles that didn't make it into this edition. And I felt, by and large, that the quality of writing in Eremos over the last 40 years had been so good that it's just a pity that most of it would be lost in time. And I thought if we can capture a representative sample of the sort of things we talked about and the quality of the writing, it would be a real celebration for this 40th anniversary.
Well, picking up that theme of celebration, Linda, you're somebody who's been around since the beginning of Eremos and closely linked it to the magazine for much of that time. This must be an occasion of genuine celebration for you, that here we are 40 years on saying, isn't this great? Yes. Tell us the elements that led to the group getting together to put Eremos together and then launch the magazine?
So we're talking about the really early years, and really things started prior to 1983. Bruce Wilson went overseas. He wanted a renewal, a new vision, and he researched what was happening mainly in the UK. And he and Don and Colin and Jackie and Janet Stacey, a whole group of people, Patricia Brennan, Margaret was around, Margaret Yeh, thinking about how Christians can live in the context of Australia, modern Australia. And their vision was to deepen Christian spirituality, but also to engage with the culture, engage with our history, our traditions, engage with the difficulties of what was then a kind of split between a very cerebral kind of Christianity that they were experiencing in Sydney particularly, and their desire to have faith worked out in terms of the whole of the body, the whole of the mind, the whole of the emotions, to live with that integrity and congruence and contribute to Australian culture and society. It's a fantastic vision, and I really celebrate that they thought like this at that time, and 40 years later, Eremos did it all that time for 40 years in different ways. Now, the original vision was Sydney, maybe moving wider to Australia. It was for Christians who wanted to really grow. It was for what they called backsliders, that language that we used to use, or fading Christians. And also for honest seekers, so thinking beyond those who identified as Christian people at the time. I'll show you a couple of things. This was one of the very early brochures, and at the bottom of every communication, every letter, they had a verse from Psalms, and it just shows you how committed they were. O God, thou art my God, I seek thee. My soul thirsts for thee, my flesh faints for thee, as in a dry and weary land where no water is. So there was a deep desire, and there was a bit of angst about the business of engaging with Australian culture, because everybody was keen, yes, let's deepen Christian spirituality, but let's not have a no-holds-barred approach, to what we're going to say about Australian culture. And let's not just join the bandwagon of different social issues. Let's really think through, what does our theology say? What do we say as people experiencing that theology and our faith? And that's some of the emphases: experience, the body, lay theology developing. Now, I've got to say, this is all in the context of what I call a complication. Now, my son will forgive me. When he was 7 years old in year 3, his teacher taught him how to analyse literature. And he'd analyse everything. We'd be watching TV. Mum, this ad doesn't have a complication. Well, Eremos was born of that complication. It was difficult to be a Christian living out your faith. And I applaud, I celebrate the fact that Eremos started like that and has kept going. We've moved in our slogans or our mottos. Some were scripture, some were things we thought out. And I've got to say, all credit to Colin, to Don, to Bruce, to all those people, to Jackie, who held Eremos together for so long. Eremos, the original idea was even to buy a property, have a retreat house and build a bush chapel. That was a huge effort. They actually got going on it and it fell through. It was a big thing that they had to let go of. But the community got created somehow, and the newsletter was critical for that. As you're saying, fantastic quality. Here's another of Margaret Ackland's...
I think that's 18 covers I've done.
covers. Fabulously quality articles. But it was also the way in which communication about the other aspects of Eremos happened. And this came out 4 or 5 times a year. We all hung onto it. We all got the brochures inside about the retreats and the Tate ministry and the events. There was no way. I mean, you've got to think too, articles came in handwriting and typed, and there were people who had entered them into the little computer that we were sharing at St Augustine Church in Neutral Bay and then in Newtown. So a big effort and a high quality publication that held the thread. But in the end, the vision was much more a face-to-face thing, the early visions, and it's continued with the retreat team and the events of engaging with people, hearing fantastic speakers, thinking through what is life about, what is meaning about, and how do we engage with Australian culture. The essays too were fantastic. I mean, I remember Bruce Wilson and Colin's essays just set you thinking, you know, do we want to be adolescents at 65? You know, let's have emotional and psychological growth along with spiritual growth. It was a groundbreaking thing at the time, and it's so wonderful that so many institutions now embrace that sort of concept in Christian faith, but Eremos was a pioneer.
Yes, it seems to me, based in part on what you said, but from my own observations, that the sort of thing Eremos is talking about as particular and novel, even radical at the time, has now become part of the landscape of general spirituality, and not in a way which is in any way diminished what Eremos has done. In fact, it has made the whole project extraordinarily relevant. And relevant too, even in contemporary political terms. John, a couple of the articles you selected go straight to Indigenous issues, and this year, of all years, it becomes critically significant. I was at an iftar dinner just a few nights ago, sponsored by the Uniting Church out in Lakemba, and the Grand Mufti came along and said he was going to ask all mosques to encourage people to support the voice, which I thought was extraordinary. I mean, extraordinary. And here we have a tradition in Eremos that has been articulating that, and it seems now, and this is the value of going back 40 years, for so long we've been treading this road. And the value of looking back there is really critical, because it does remind you we really have been too long about this.
Yes. One of the things I noticed when, and before I came here today, yesterday, I sat down and read the whole thing through again. And one of the things I noticed was a progression of change in the way in which Eremos is presenting itself. And the Indigenous articles are a really good example of it. What I noticed is in the early days, as Linda has articulated, there were big issues that were looked at. And even though Bruce was adamant that this was a whole person looking at it, it's actually quite cerebral, a lot of it. As John says, as time has gone on, these things have become mainstream, and so how has Eremos responded to that? It's become more reflective. And when you get to the beginning of this century, the articles become much more introspective, I think. And I wanted to say further on, I won't say it now, but where do we go now? How do we retain an edge that sort of still speaks to our society? As John and I were saying beforehand, in a very different world now than it was then. But if you look at the three articles that have some kind of Indigenous focus, they kind of illustrate that. The first one is by Jack Horner and Kevin Gilbert, about the whole concept of how we engage with Indigenous Australia. The second one is by Jane Fulcher, no relation. All right, she's my wife. And it's based on the idea of lament and connects the experience of Indigenous Australians with the Holocaust and Jewish people's connection there. And then the third one is much further on by Xanthan Black Cockatoo, and it's much more experiential. He just talks about moving through the landscape. And I thought those three indicate something about the way in which, sort of Eremos is engaged with things.
There's another one too that picks that up, and that's one of the final ones by Tony Hassan, who I mentioned, where the nature of race or those distinctions we make on base are actually deeply embedded and run through our culture in all sorts of ways, not just the colour of skin.
Yeah. And Tony's coming from a different background too, because she's coming from a black South African or a coloured South African background. And so there is that massive change that's going on. But I did want to say at that stage that this idea that things that Eremos put up that were cutting edge, now becoming mainstream, has given us a bit of a dilemma. And I wanted to say something about the last article in the entire magazine. The last article is an interview with Greg Sheridan, the Foreign Affairs editor for The Australian. And someone not associated with Eremos, when I got the opportunity to interview Greg, said to me, "What are you doing that for? He's a right-wing bastard." And he is. He's really right-wing, and he's this really sort of strict Catholic. And I thought, no, at the moment, right now, he's exactly what we should be doing, is interviewing. I found him a lovely human being, by the way, and a very humble man. But because I was thinking, we're at that stage where do we want our magazine to become an echo chamber for our members, or a forum where we actually question now the assumptions that we've taken for so long? And I think that's, to me, I hope that's a way we can go. It's something that we need to consider, as Linda said. Today, though, is a cause for celebration more than anything. But we do have to think, well, if we still have relevance after 40 years, what does it look like now? What's the battleground now?
Get into that in a minute. Margaret, you've had a chance to observe so many of the covers over the years, and people have commented on them as each one being something to look forward to. Have you noticed a development over the years, or some sort of threads running through of commonalities?
Oh, well, when I saw a lot together yesterday morning, I just, it really, you know, the 40-something years, it shows me from, you know, a beginning artist to now. So, and I did a lot, I think, because I was convenient and there, and I think it's been it's been great that I hardly do any anymore, except for this last one. But it's been fantastic that there's been a bit of colour, there are all sorts of different contributors, and it's just been a really nice diversity in what's there. I think my brief was usually to respond to a particular article, or they might have even given me most of the magazine and I could pick what I was going to respond to. Some of them I can remember what it was, and then a couple I thought, what on earth was that about? Why did I do that? So it's funny looking back.
As somebody who was concerned with the wider place of Eremos in the community, what were the key moments for you that you see reflected in this sort of magazine, anniversary magazine, that we have now? Are there any sort of key markers along the way you say, yep, that was one of them, that's another, and these are the things we hoped would come out of that?
I think that reading the articles in this issue, they seem so fresh again, even the really early ones. Like Don Meadows' article about pleasure is just superb. James Ileff's one about marking of the body and territory and claiming who you are, and the protest and pain that, you know, mutilation of the body and sort of art forms and tattooing and all the darker side of it is still extremely relevant. And there's still big resistance in many ways to the sort of things that Eremos has been saying over the last 40 years, early till now. I mean, very early on, I think it was Church Record, I think, you know, really criticised Eremos, saying that promoting an esoteric atheism, and which was completely off the mark. No recognition of really what was being attempted. But you still encounter people in our lives who have that vision of Christians being extremely, you know, off the planet, don't connect with Australian culture, don't understand what it is to be human, and yet so many of the articles, Diana Newt's article there is just stunning about how do I think to live, how do I live? And she, in the end, claims her humanity. And, I mean, isn't that what Jesus did? Claimed his humanity for us. You know, who else do we follow? Because that's what becoming truly human it's all about. And that sort of transformation is still so relevant now.
The other things that I admired out of going through this selection, which is again part of what's the thread of the magazine, is you can get people coming at this from different angles. You have Charles Birch, who I mentioned earlier, going to something that's profoundly deep, yet for him elementally simple, and searching for its relevance now, saying this matters now. And at the same time, you can get Bruce Wilson's 1984 article on television, watching the news, and you think, this could be yesterday, only now it's worse. and that is something that's quite consistent about Eremos, whilst it can be deep but also immediately contemporary. It searches for the simple kernel at the heart of things. And I think that's about the artwork too. There's something profoundly central and ultimately still and central about these things. John, as somebody, did you read every article of every issue for 40 years?
Yes, I did. It actually came at a good time for me because at the end of August last year I had a shoulder replacement and I was completely laid up. And I was completely laid up with this pile of Eremoses this big in front of me. I did read them all. Some in more depth than others, if I'm going to be honest. There were some I thought, no, not going to put this one in. But mainly I did. I read them all. And it was a labour of love, I have to say. By the time I'd finished, I felt quite privileged to have been able to do that.
And can you tell us something about the poets, the poetry? I can think of the cartoonists. I remember Stephen Frith and Bob Searle, Graham English. Yeah. But can you tell us, because what you're speaking about, that deep kernel, came out in a lot of the poetry.
As someone who's always written poetry myself, that's one of the things I've really appreciated about Eremos. I used to teach poetry to Years 11 and 12 students, and we'd come up with definitions, and one of the definitions that to me was really important was I always used to say, poetry is an attempt to find words for the things there are no words for. The present poet laureate in England, Simon Armitage, described being a poet as forever apprentice to an unachievable goal. And I think poetry, therefore, to me, is an essentially spiritual exercise because it's about the things that make us human, but they're not rational. They exist below the rational, and the writing of the poem brings them up into the rational. And I think it's one of the things that I've loved about Eremos is its commitment to not just poetry, but the poetic impulse and what it means. There have been some poets who have always been committed to Eremos. In the early days, it was people like Jeff Guess, Andrew Lansdowne did some. Diana Nutz was a very strong contributor. Rita Glennon more recently. And these people, to me, always added something new, something powerful that prose couldn't offer. Yep.
One could think of the interview with Les Murray that's in here as well, and resonances keep ticking over. Veronica Brady, I mentioned earlier, the first program I ever did with Veronica Brady was, she titled it "Acutist at its Vanishing." And I said, what do you mean? And she said, and she spoke of Australian poetry and A.D. Hope, and particularly a poem by his that is very close to spiritual. It really is about, he uses the analogy of a grape picking, speklesi, the late picking, and the vine becomes acutist, or the wine becomes acutist at the moment that it is about to decay. Yet out of that springs hope. And I think that's one of the things that when you work through material like this, you say this is forever new. It renews as it's given forth. It renews. That spiritual tradition strikes me in the artwork and in what's been said. We're talking about people, many of whom have now retired, some of whom have passed on, but their work is very significantly maintained here. Just some observations you may have about people who've been significant along the way. We've mentioned Bruce Wilson and Don Meadows and one or two others, but who else has been significant for Eremos and significant in what they've done for Australia through Eremos?
Well, there's a lot of people. If you think over the last 40 years, I've got to pay tribute to Kate Scholl. Okay, Kate came on board. Kate came on board in 1996 and has been involved deeply with Eremos ever since. And it was an absolute pleasure to work with her. And her drive and her way of meeting challenges is just inspiring. We've had other fantastic people on the Eremos Council, executive directors. Carolyn's here, she was an executive director, Carolyn Craig Emerson. Her husband, William Emerson, was one of the people really early on in getting Eremos going. Joy Connor is here. Joy's been involved with Eremos on and off, and she's done a huge amount for the refugees in Australia, not just the Blue Mountains, but in Australia. I paid tribute to her. I can't think of Frances Mackay. Oh, wonderful, where's Frances? There you are. It was great to work with Frances, because when I would write for the magazine, she would give me really good feedback. I mean, I know, look, we all know Don Meadows and the fantastic contribution he did. He made me a writer. I remember when I wrote my first article, it took me 2 years. I had a baby, I had no time, and I did a magnificent job. I think it was a book review, a straight-out man about Pastor Albrecht in the Central Australia and his relationships with Aboriginal people and the mission there. And Don Meadows wrote back saying, "You have laboured mightily on this," and he ran amok with a red pen. And by the time I got to Frances, she still didn't shirk telling me where I needed to improve my writing. So the people like the editors, Don, Noel Giblett, Fran, Jackie, have really contributed to Australian society through how they've helped the artists and the writers, and they've worked hard with them. We all know, and we're very proud of Les Murray, what a fantastic poet. But it's the people who came to Eremos, the ordinary people in many ways, in their contexts, whether they were ministers or they were working in their church or they were just working in their jobs, who stood up when they needed to, because that complication of how to be a Christian in our society still exists. And it's really hard to find a voice. I think it's even harder now because Christians have got such bad press and they've done such terrible things through history, and it's all come to light. And there's that whole sense of, can we survive as Christians? And I think the people who've been members of Eremos have been sustained by the riches of the retreats and the magazine articles and knowing each other in order to stand up in their situations and follow their authenticity, their genuineness in their faith and their following of God. And that's what the original expressions were of what they wanted to happen when Eremos started. And I think it's still really important today.
Two other people I think are worth noting are our publishers, our printers, Felix and Kate, who've just supported us throughout the whole endeavour. I was talking to Kate, our editor, our publisher, when I was putting this together, and we tried to do it so that if you look at the typeface throughout the magazine, it's exactly as it was printed. So we wanted to literally have the visual changing face of Eremos as well. And I said to Kate, I'm so sorry that we've provided you with this real problem. And she said, of all our customers, the one we really love is Eremos. They're our favourite. And I thought that was wonderful. She also said to me, when I first took over the job, I was doing my editing and, you know, putting the red pen on things, and we were proofreading, and I'm not a good proofreader. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm not as forensic as Francis, who I took over from. And Kate's response was, no one is as forensic as Francis.
Well, which brings us to where to from here, because this is something that's not just confronting magazines of this quality, such as Eremos. There's an article here, it's close to the end, by Quentin Grafton on artificial intelligence, the great disruptor. And this article would have been written and submitted for publication before the latest disruption, which is ChatGPT, where artificial intelligence now offers to take over our universe for us, and the role of the written word is being sort of severely marginalised, and social media, of course, is sort of it's obliterating personal connection, but at the same time connecting everybody. So there are challenges which go directly to the heart of the reason Eremos exists that are confronting us at the moment, and will manifest themselves in quite significant ways, I think, over the next couple of years. Do publications like this have a future? How else are people to talk at depth and discover each other at depth? Where do we go from here? As you sort of ruminate on these things. Well, John first, because you raised it.
Oh, sorry. Looking through the magazine over that 40 years, that was the question that was in the back of my mind all the time. Where do we go from here? Particularly in the fact that we have an ageing readership, which we do. And I don't want to get pessimistic for a moment, but there's every chance Eremos won't make 50. It might not. So what? We were talking about this beforehand. How many magazines like ours have lasted 40 years? Not many. So the contribution we've made, one way or the other, we can't lose. But if we want to keep being relevant, it seems to me, John, you mentioned, artificial intelligence, social media, but at the heart of that is something human that those things have facilitated. And that is the polarisation of the world that we live in. And one of the things I say in my editorial is you see it in language. The word racist. Now, when I was younger, we used the word ethnocentric. But it seemed, and ethnocentric means seeing things through your own tribe's eyes, which we all do. And it's a human tendency that we need to fight. Racism, I always understood to be the belief that one race is superior to another and acting on it. But the word ethnocentrism has disappeared from our language. And we only have one word now, and that's racist. So it means the Ku Klux Klan and the poor football commentator who can't pronounce the Samoan player's name are both branded with the same word. And to me that indicates something about the brutalisation of our language, which is leading to the polarisation of our thought. I think that a magazine like Eremos's role is to work against that. And it's one of the reasons why, getting back to that interview with Greg Sheridan, that I think it was important, is because what I think we should be doing is getting back to a nuanced human view of things rather than a tribal view. And, I find sometimes that if you express certain what we really have to watch is both the extreme left and the extreme right. That's where the problem's coming. And they are subsuming the moderate left and the moderate right. And I think a magazine like Eremos's job is to pull these things back into a generous view of life that acknowledges the the multiplicity of views. And if I can just get controversial for a moment, just to finish, Margaret and I were walking up here from where we were walking, and the voice came up. And I said, "What are you going to vote?" And Margaret said, "I'm going to vote yes." And I said, "So am I." And then Margaret said, "There are very good reasons for voting no." And I said, "Yes, there are. But for me, the reasons for voting yes outdo them." And I thought for a moment and thought, there are people who won't admit there are very good reasons for voting no. There are people who won't admit there are very good reasons for voting yes. And our job is to say that is the case. And we move forward making enemies on both sides because we acknowledge the goodness that's there. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Reflections on the challenges?
I'm totally enthralled by what you're saying there, John. And I think many people here, I know, are involved deeply in acting and social justice causes. Rosalind's been doing heaps for The Voice and campaigning. And my understanding, if you're really on the ground, protesting, acting hard, seeking justice, you need some sort of sustaining transcendence to keep you going. And those practices that Eremos started with, that wanted to recover, like silence and meditation, body prayer, fasting, communal spirituality, they're needed in order to sustain that level of activity on the ground. And there's so much to address now. And you read about it in the papers and you can get so depressed. And I feel lots happening in the schools now. Even in, when I'm working in the library, we have toolbox kit talks and we're told to meditate. But actually working out how to do this in our busy lives and being supported and encouraged, I still think there's a huge role for that.